They called it slag. The steel mill left 40 tons of it. She turned it into a fortune. They called it slag. 40 tons of it. Baked into the earth at the back of the Carver Steel property like a gray wound that nobody wanted to look at. The County Environmental Board called it a remediation liability. The demolition crew called it a headache. The new property developer who bought the mill site in the spring of 1991 called it a line item. A number on an invoice for somebody to haul away at his expense and make disappear. He had architects coming in 3 weeks, and he wanted the lot clean. He had a clipboard and a timeline, and he was not the kind of man who revised either. Her grandfather called it something else. She remembered the word from his journals, from a page she'd read 6 months ago at the kitchen table with boots still on, hands cold, the single bulb swinging slow in the draft. He'd written it in pencil, pressed hard into the page in that cramped slant she'd grown up trying to decipher. Waste is just a material no one has listened to yet. That's what he called it. She called it a start. Nora Vance backs the flatbed through the Carver Steel East Gate at 5:45 on a Tuesday morning in April 1991, and there isn't a soul on that property but her. Just the diesel knock of the truck, the creak of the gate on its last hinge, and 40 tons of gray-green slag piled along the back fence like a busted mountain nobody claimed. The sky is the color of old tin. The slag heap smells like iron and sulfur and something deeper underneath. Mineral, cool, almost like creek stone after rain. She steps out of the cab, and the gravel crunches under her boots, the leather worn soft at the toe, and stained at the ankle from 3 seasons of mud she hasn't bothered scraping off. The air bites. She can feel it across the bridge of her nose where the freckles sit dark from last summer's sun, still there in April like they forgot to leave. She is 23 years old. Her hair is a dark chestnut braid that hangs past her left shoulder, a few strands loose at the temples where the work has already started. She wears a faded olive green canvas jacket, the pockets deep enough to hold a pair of pliers and a folding measure, and still buttoned closed. The jacket was her grandfather's before it was hers, and it fits her like it was made by someone who had her measurements all along. Clipped to the right breast pocket is a brass-cased pocket caliper on a short bootlace, the kind machinists use for checking tolerance, the kind her grandfather carried every day of his working life. The brass is worn smooth at the thumb point where he rolled it open 10,000 times. She does it the same way without thinking about it. She inherited the caliper 6 months ago. She also inherited 12 acres of marginal ground outside of Belhaven, Ohio, a 1974 flatbed in need of new shocks. A machine shop the size of a double wide with a broken press brake and a borrowed belt grinder, and a pile of debt that the bank had been patient about for exactly as long as her grandfather was alive. When he died in October, the patience stopped. She'd gotten one extension, a polite one, and the letter spelling out the terms of the second one was folded in her jacket pocket next to the caliper. What she also inherited: 3 hardbound journals, green covers, water-stained at the spine, pages gone soft as cloth at the corners from a lifetime of hands. The first one begins in 1954. The last entry is from August of last year, 6 weeks before he died, written in pencil in that same cramped forward slant. Slag is not a waste product. Slag is a mineral record. It remembers every heat it passed through. She'd read it by lamplight in October with mud on her boots and a cup of coffee gone cold at her elbow, and she hadn't known what to do with it. Not yet. By April, she did. She'd been at the county records office for 3 days in February when she found the Carver Steel environmental filing. 52 pages. The relevant part was on page 31. buried in an appendix written in language designed to be unread, approximately 40 metric tons of air-cooled blast furnace slag, accumulated 1964-1989, present on eastern lot boundary. Remediation cost estimated $18,000, $24,000. Buyer assumes full disposition responsibility. She did the math. Then she called the developer. His name was Gary Hollis, and he drove a clean white Chevy Suburban that had never seen a county road worse than a 4. He wore a charcoal sport coat with no tie, the kind of jacket that costs $600 and is supposed to look like it costs $400. His shoes were black Oxfords, polished, and they were ruined by the gravel before he made it 20 feet from the gate. He had rimless rectangular glasses with thin wire arms and a stainless clipboard pressed flat against his chest like it was the only thing holding him upright. His hair was sandy, going thin at the crown, combed flat in a direction it didn't want to go. When he talked, he rocked heel to toe, chin up 1.5 degrees. The patient little smile of a man who has never, not once in his professional career, been surprised by an outcome. He looked at her boots first, then at the braid, the jacket, the freckles. He did his pricing in about 4 seconds. He came in low. "You're Vance's granddaughter." Not a question. He said it like a file reference. "I am." "Well," he tilted his head. "Your grandfather was a tinkerer. Good man, I'm sure, but tinkerers don't usually leave much behind that a bank wants to hold." He smiled the patient smile. "Now I've got architects on site in 3 weeks and a remediation cost that's keeping me up at night. I'm offering to let you haul that material at no charge to you. You provide the labor, I provide the release. You walk away with 40 tons of slag, and I walk away with a clean lot." He paused. "Sweetheart, I'm not going to pretend this is a gift. Nobody wants that stuff. But it's yours free of charge and free of paperwork if you can move it by the 14th. Nora looked at him for a moment. "I'll need it in writing." He laughed. Not mean about it, more like he was confused why she wanted documentation of nothing. But he wrote it on the back of a contractor form and signed it, the signature looping fast and confident, the signature of a man who was used to closing things. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. "When can you start?" he said. "Already started," she said, and walked back to the flatbed. He stood there a moment with his clipboard and his ruined shoes, and then he got back in the Suburban and left. Have you ever looked at something the whole world had priced and decided, not guessed, not hoped, but decided in your gut that every single one of them had it wrong? Here is the thing about blast furnace slag that nobody in a room with carpet and fluorescent lights ever bothered to learn. When iron ore gets smelted, when the iron separates out at temperatures above 1400 degrees Celsius, the impurities float. They float up in a layer of molten rock, and they get skimmed off, or they run out through a separate channel, and they cool. That cooling is everything. If you cool slag fast, with water, you get a glass-like granular material that's nearly indistinguishable from volcanic pumice at the molecular level. If you let it cool slowly, in air, the way the Carver Mill did for 25 years, you get something different. A crystalline, vesicular stone. Dense where you need it, porous where you need that too. Heavy, gray-green, depending on the iron content and the limestone ratio in the original charge. Her grandfather had measured it. That was in the second journal, the one from the late 60s. He'd been doing small jobs for the mill at the time, sharpening and resetting equipment, and he'd had occasion to take samples home in his coat pocket, which was the kind of thing you could do in 1968 if you asked the foreman nicely. He tested the compressive strength with a borrowed press. He measured the pH. He measured the thermal coefficient. He wrote 4 pages about it. The phrase he kept coming back to, the phrase she'd underlined with a fingernail because she didn't have a pen handy: this material holds heat the way a good stone wall holds heat. It does not rush. It does not let go. She'd read that line in February, sitting at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with the bank letter on one side and the journal on the other, and she had gone very still for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called her one friend in the construction materials business, a woman named Petra, who ran a small aggregate supply out of Columbus. And she asked one question: "What's the going rate on drainage aggregate right now?" Petra told her. She sat with that number for a while. Then she asked a second question. "What about thermal mass tile? Landscaping stone? What are contractors paying for material that'll hold heat in a passive solar application?" Petra said she'd have to check around. She checked around. She called back the next morning. Nora wrote the number down. She looked at it. 40 tons. That number, she multiplied it out twice to make sure she hadn't made an error. She hadn't. The first 3 loads went wrong. She'd rented a jaw crusher and a trommel screen on a 2-week contract, which she could barely cover, and she set up in the back corner of her grandfather's yard behind the machine shop. And she ran the first batch of slag through on a Thursday morning in late April, and it came out wrong. Too fine. The crusher was set for aggregate gradation, but the material was crystallizing differently under the jaw pressure than she'd calculated. And what came out looked like gray sand and would grade out as structural fill at best, which was a third of the value she needed. She stood there in the dust with a double handful of crushed material running through her fingers and felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders. Not the material, not the 40 pounds of rock she'd just processed, but the weight of the invoice on the rental equipment, and the weight of the bank letter, and the weight of 3 weeks of planning that had just run through her hands like sand. She looked at what she had. She set the double handful down on the table she'd built for this, and she looked at it for a long time. Then she went to the journal. Page 43 of the second volume. He'd written it in the margin sideways, cramped even by his standards, as if he'd thought of it in the middle of something else. Stone that has been through fire once does not yield the same way twice. Slow the break. Let it find its own cleavage. Slow the break. She pulled the crusher manual, found the jaw gap adjustment, and widened it by 8 millimeters. She slowed the feed rate. She ran the next batch through at 2/3 speed and pulled a sample at the midpoint and held it up in the flat morning light. Blocky, angular the fracture, faces catching the sun at different angles, like broken flint. The exact gradation profile she needed. Plus minus a millimeter from the spec she'd written in February. She felt something happen in her chest then. Something she had no word for that wasn't too large, and she went back to work. By the end of May, she had processed 11 tons, sorted into 3 grades: structural drainage aggregate, thermal landscaping tile cut from the denser pieces, and a third category she'd started calling architectural stone, irregular slabs with natural surface texture and a color that sat somewhere between charcoal and sage green. Unlike anything on the market, because it literally didn't exist on the market. Because nobody had thought to look at slag and see a tile. She took samples to a landscape architect in Columbus named Meredith Claus, who had a reputation for sourcing unusual natural materials. Meredith picked up the largest piece, turned it over twice, set it on her desk, and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "What's the thermal mass rating?" Nora gave her the numbers from the grandfather's tests, cross-referenced with 2 university papers she'd found at the library. Meredith said, "Leave me 6 pieces. I'll put them in front of 2 clients this week." She did not say, This is incredible. She did not say, amazing. She said, leave me 6 pieces, which is the only language that matters. Have you ever had somebody pick up the best thing you own and stay quiet? Just quiet? Not because they didn't understand it. Because they did? Gary Hollis came back on a Wednesday in early June. He'd heard she was running equipment on the back of the Carver site, which she was, still pulling the last of the material under the terms of the signed release. He parked the Suburban and walked across the gravel in new shoes, not Oxford's this time, a tan suede boot that was already wrong for the site, and he came at her with the clipboard and the same patient smile and his chin up its characteristic 1.5 degrees. I heard you found a buyer, he said. I found several, she said. Well, he tilted his head. Look, there's something poetic about that. Seriously, good for you. But I've been thinking, there's a market here I wasn't accounting for, and I'm developing a second lot in Marietta. And if you want to talk about a partnership arrangement, no, she said. He waited for the rest. There wasn't any rest. He wrote something on his clipboard. He smiled the patient smile. He said he'd be in touch if his position changed. He walked back to the Suburban, and the shoes were already gray with dust, and when he opened the door she could see him doing the math on something and coming up a little short. She went back to the crusher. Have you ever watched someone realize they've already lost something without knowing when it happened? The first architectural stone check arrived on a Thursday in late June while she was resetting the trommel screen bearings and had grease to the elbow on both arms. Petra had connected her with a landscape firm in Cincinnati that had sourced 40 square feet for a garden wall installation, a test project. The kind of small order that either leads somewhere or doesn't. Nora had priced it at $40 a square foot because that was the low end of the premium stone market, and she'd wanted the order, had needed the order, had spent 3 days talking herself down from pricing it at $35. The check was for $1,600. She looked at it for a long time. She wiped her hands on the shop rag, and she did the remaining math on the back of a scrap piece of cardboard. 40 tons. What she'd processed. What she had left. The remaining production cost on the rented equipment. She checked the column twice, and then once more. She put the check in her jacket pocket next to the caliper and went back to the bearings. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the check on one side and the bank letter on the other and the journal open in the middle. The bulb over the sink put yellow light across the table. Outside the window it was raining. A soft summer rain that ticked on the tin extension roof and made the machine shop smell like warm metal and wet earth. She could see her breath, barely, just the faintest mist at the edge of the light. She was not thinking about the check. She was thinking about the other letter. The second one, newer, from a civil engineering firm in Akron that Meredith had passed her name to. They were speccing a passive solar commercial building, and they needed thermal mass material. Lots of it, consistent gradation, documented performance data, and they'd asked if she could supply it. The volume they'd quoted was more than she had left at the Carver site. She sat with that problem for a long time. Then she went to the shelf where the journals lived, and she took down the third one, the last one, the one whose final entry was from August of the year before. She flipped to a section in the middle, one she'd bookmarked with a strip of leather, a passage her grandfather had written in 1983 after driving past a closed electric arc furnace plant on Route 22 that had been dumping slag in a field off the county road for years. There are other piles, he wrote. Men like that don't close one plant. They close a dozen. The piles are everywhere. Nobody's looked. She put the journal down. She picked up the phone and called the county records office and left a message asking what they had on file for closed industrial sites in a 5-county radius. Then She went to bed. In the morning, she went back to work. The county records search took a week and turned up 9 sites. She visited them over 2 weekends in July. 3 were already cleaned up. 2 had slag material that was too fine, too weathered, too far gone to be worth the transport. 1 was in an active legal dispute she wanted no part of. But 3 of them, a closed ferroalloy plant in Muskingum County, an old coke processing facility outside Zanesville, and a site that had been an iron foundry in the 1940s and sat behind a weedy chain-link fence on the edge of a town called Caldwell. Those 3 sites had material. Good material. She stood at the edge of the Caldwell site on a Tuesday afternoon with the caliper out of her pocket, rolling it open in her fingers the way her grandfather had, and she looked at the gray-green pile sitting in the flat July light, and she thought, "You have been waiting here since 1952, and nobody ever listened to you." She listened. She made 3 calls and negotiated 3 separate agreements in the same 2-week window, each one structured the same way as the Carver release. She provides the labor. They provide the paperwork. The slag is hers. The sites get cleaned. She gets the material. Gary Hollis-style math, but in her favor this time. There is a man in Belhaven named Walt Gruner who has farmed the adjacent parcel to her grandfather's property for 22 years. He is the kind of man who keeps his opinions short and carries a chipped white enamel mug everywhere he goes, coffee or otherwise, the handle worn down to bare metal on the inside. He had watched the flatbed come and go from her yard all spring and summer, with his arms folded and his feet wide, and he had said nothing in particular about it, except once to her, in passing at the co-op in May, that he hoped she wasn't spending money she didn't have on something she didn't understand. He came to her gate on a Tuesday morning in August, with his mug and his folded arms and his feet wide, and he said, "I heard you picked up the Muskingum site." "I did," she said. A pause. He looked at the machine shop, at the sorted piles of stone, at the labeled sample bins stacked along the south wall under the overhang. "How do you sort the grades?" he said. His hat was in his hand, not off in some dramatic way, just in his hand where it had ended up. He was looking at the bins. He was asking the question he'd clearly driven over rehearsing. She said, "I'll show you." She walked him through the grading system. He asked one more question, a technical one, about the density differential between the air-cooled and water-cooled fractions. She answered it. He nodded. He said thank you, and put his hat back on and walked to his truck. That was the whole apology. Men like Walt don't say they were wrong. They take their hat off and ask a question that means they want to know. The firm in Akron signed a contract in September for 42 tons of specified thermal mass aggregate to be delivered in staged loads over 6 months. It was the largest single order Nora had filled. It was also, she calculated on the back of another piece of cardboard, enough to cover the bank in full and have something left. She did not call anyone. She drove to Caldwell and stood in front of the pile and looked at it for a while. Then she drove home and started loading. Have you ever done the math and then checked it again just to make sure you hadn't imagined it and found out you hadn't? By the following spring, Gary Hollis's development in Marietta had stalled. The second lot sat fenced and idle, the architectural drawings still on a schedule that kept getting revised. She read about it in the county business section of the local paper. 3 paragraphs, the kind of article that gets written when someone's confidence outpaces their capital. He called her in March. He said he was repositioning his approach to the materials side of the business and thought there might be an opportunity to collaborate on sourcing. She listened to the whole thing. She said, "I'm not taking on partners." He waited. That was all there was. He said he appreciated her time and got off the phone. She could hear. and the way he said time, that somewhere in a clean car going somewhere on a paved road, a man with a clipboard was trying to understand where the math had gone wrong, and was going to arrive at the wrong answer, and would revise his forms accordingly and carry on. She put the phone down and went back to work. Meredith Claus passed her name to 4 more firms that year. One was a commercial passive solar developer. One was a university campus project in Columbus looking for low-carbon building material with documented performance data. One was a residential landscaping firm in Cleveland, whose clients had the kind of money that pays for unusual materials and calls them artisan. And one was a civil engineering professor named Hollander, who had published 2 papers on reclaimed industrial aggregate and wanted samples for a research project, which was not a money relationship, but which was eventually the most valuable of the 4, because when the paper came out in 1993, with documented performance data attached to her material under its trademarked name, Belhaven Thermal Stone, a name she'd come up with at the kitchen table on a Tuesday, the inquiries started coming from places she hadn't thought to look. She hired Walt Gruner's son that summer. She hired 2 more people in the fall. By the end of 1993, she had processed and sold a total of 310 tons of reclaimed blast furnace slag from 8 closed industrial sites in 4 counties. The machine shop had been expanded twice. The 1974 flatbed had been retired and replaced with a proper aggregate hauler she'd bought used from a man in Cossacton who didn't ask why she wanted it, which was the kind of transaction she preferred. The bank sent her a Christmas card. She put it on the shelf next to the journals. 21 years don't announce themselves. They accumulate the way slag builds up behind a furnace. Slow, invisible, and then suddenly substantial. It is 2012. The machine shop is not a machine shop anymore. It is a 6,000 square foot production and grading facility on 12 acres that have acquired 3 adjacent parcels over 2 decades. Belhaven Thermal Stone appears in the specifications for 47 commercial buildings across 5 states, in the sourcing materials for 3 university sustainability programs, and in a brochure published by the State Environmental Agency as a model for beneficial reuse of industrial byproduct. Language her grandfather would have found both satisfying and slightly formal. The faded olive canvas jacket is the same jacket she wore to the Carver Gate in 1991, except this one is the 3rd generation. The original fell apart in 1999, and she bought a replacement from the same manufacturer. And when that one wore through at the left elbow in 2007, she found another. Some things don't need reinventing. Her braid is dark chestnut threaded through with silver now. The same loose wisps at the temples from work already done. The freckles across the bridge of her nose have deepened into the kind of marks that don't come from one summer. The brass caliper is still clipped to the right breast pocket. It belonged to her grandfather for 40 years, and to her for 21, and the brass at the thumb point is as smooth as a river stone. She is standing in the back of the facility sorting a new intake, a load from a shut-blast furnace up in Pennsylvania, material she's been negotiating access to for 3 months, when the truck comes through the gate. Mud in the wheel wells, cracked windshield. A woman in the cab who looks like someone who drove all morning without stopping. She is 24 years old. Her name is Dara. She came from a message Hollander passed along, the professor, retired now but still referring people, because this woman had read his paper, the one from 1993, and then tracked down every subsequent piece of documentation she could find, and had written Nora a letter that said, among other things, I found a pile. I don't know what I'm looking at, but I think it's the same thing. She got out of the truck carrying a notebook. Not a green hardcover, a yellow legal pad, fat with folded pages. Nora walked over and looked at her. Show me what you found, she said. They walked the facility for 2 hours. Nora showed her the grading system, the crusher setup, the way to read the fracture face for density, the way to measure the vesicularity by eye once you'd seen enough of it. The thermal coefficient testing rig her grandfather had invented, and she had rebuilt twice. The sample library going back to 1991. Every site documented, every load labeled. Dara asked good questions, not clever questions. The right questions. The questions you can only ask if you've been looking at the same problem long enough to understand what you don't know yet. At the end of it, they stood by the intake pile. The Pennsylvania load, slag the color of a winter sky, and Nora reached into her jacket pocket and unclipped the brass caliper from the loop of bootless and held it out. Dara looked at it. "Take it," Nora said. Dara took it. She turned it over in her palm. The brass caught the late afternoon light. Nora pulled the third journal from her other pocket. She'd started carrying it again 6 months ago, when the Pennsylvania negotiations had started, and she'd been rereading the margins and held it out. "Page 43, she said. "Margin note. Read it before you touch the crusher settings." Dara took the journal. Waste is just a material no one has listened to yet. She said it aloud without being asked, because she'd read it in the letter Hollander had forwarded, the one quoting the 1993 paper, which quoted Nora, which had come from the journal in the first place. Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the hedgerow at the back of the property, the old fence line from her grandfather's time, grown tall now. And she did not look back, hands loose at her sides, boots hitting the gravel the way they always had. She left Dara standing at the pile with the caliper warm in her palm and 20 years of someone else's careful work laid out behind her like a map. There is a pile somewhere near you right now. Maybe at the back of a lot you've driven past 100 times. Maybe behind a closed plant on a county road. Maybe on paper, in an environmental filing buried in an appendix on page 31, written in language designed to be unread, sitting in a county records office in a folder marked remediation liability. Somebody priced it already. Somebody with a clipboard and a new car and a patient smile decided what it was worth and wrote it off and moved on. They're not wrong about everything, but they're wrong about this. Go look at it.